In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there stood an old house on Maple Street, where the Smith family lived. It was a picturesque setting, with white picket fences and well-manicured lawns. The Smiths were an ordinary family, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and their 2 children, Emily and Jake. They led a peaceful life, their days filled with the usual routines of school, work, and weekend outings. One chilly November afternoon, Mrs. Smith decided to visit a local antique shop. She loved antiquing, finding old treasures among the clutter, and this particular day was no different. The shop was small, tucked away on a side street, filled with dusty relics from bygone eras. Mrs. Smith perused the aisles, her fingers brushing over the various items, old furniture, tarnished silverware, and vintage toys. It was there, in a dimly lit corner of the shop, that she saw it, a doll sitting on a high shelf, its glassy eyes staring blankly at the room. The doll was dressed in a faded, antique dress, and its hair was made of tangled, coarse yarn. Despite its worn appearance, there was something oddly compelling about it. Mrs. Smith couldn't quite place why, but the doll seemed to have an aura of melancholy, as if it held secrets from a forgotten past. Intrigued, Mrs. Smith asked the shopkeeper about the doll. He looked at her with a hint of unease and mentioned that it was a recent addition to the shop, donated by a woman who had moved away. He had heard rumors that the doll was cursed, but he dismissed it as nothing more than a tale to attract customers. Nonetheless, Mrs. Smith decided to buy it. She thought it might make an interesting addition to her collection of vintage toys. That evening, Mrs. Smith presented the doll to her children. Emily, a shy 8-year-old with a penchant for all things spooky, was immediately fascinated. Jake, her 12-year-old brother, rolled his eyes but was mildly interested. They placed the doll in Emily's room, where it sat quietly on a shelf, its gaze following them as they left the room. It wasn't long before strange things began happening. At first, it was subtle, a door creaking open by itself, whispers in the dead of night, or objects being misplaced. Emily, who had always been sensitive to the supernatural, felt uneasy whenever she was alone in her room. She often heard faint whispers and felt a cold presence near her. One night, as Emily was lying in bed, she heard a soft, eerie giggle coming from the direction of the doll. The room was dark, and she could barely make out the doll's silhouette on the shelf. She tried to ignore it, but the giggling grew louder and more insistent. It was as if the doll was alive, mocking her fears. Emily's parents dismissed her claims as nightmares and overactive imagination. They chalked up the noises to the house settling or perhaps a loose floorboard. But as days passed, the occurrences grew more frequent and unsettling. The doll's eyes seemed to follow Emily around the room, and sometimes she would find it in different positions than where she had left it. One evening, after a particularly unsettling day, Mrs. Smith found Emily sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. When asked what was wrong, Emily whispered about the doll and the strange things it had been doing. Mrs. Smith, though skeptical, decided to investigate. She moved the doll to the basement, hoping that removing it from Emily's room would alleviate the child's fears. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to escalate. The basement, which had always been a place of comfort for the family, now felt oppressive and cold. Strange noises emanated from it at all hours, scratching, shuffling, and the occasional low, guttural growl. One night, Mr. Smith was working late in his study when he heard a loud crash from the basement. Grabbing a flashlight, he went downstairs to investigate. The basement was in disarray. The shelves had been knocked over, and the old furniture was scattered. At the center of the chaos was the doll, now lying face down on the floor. Its eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, and for a moment, Mr. Smith felt a shiver run down his spine. He picked up the doll and placed it back on the shelf, but the unease in the house only grew. The family tried to ignore it, but the atmosphere in the house became increasingly tense. The once peaceful environment was now fraught with an underlying sense of dread. Emily began to avoid her room altogether, sleeping in her parents' bed. Her nightmares grew worse, filled with images of the doll chasing her, its eyes burning with malevolent intent. Jake, who had initially dismissed his sister's fears, began to experience strange dreams as well. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing from dreams of dark, shadowy figures and the doll's eerie laughter. One evening, Mrs. Smith decided to take the doll outside, hoping that exposure to fresh air and sunlight might break whatever strange hold it seemed to have on the house. She placed it on a bench in the garden and went inside, but when she returned an hour later, the doll was gone. Panic set in. The family searched the yard and the surrounding area, but the doll was nowhere to be found. They assumed it had been stolen, though they couldn't imagine why anyone would take it. Days turned into weeks, and the disturbances continued. The house was now a place of constant anxiety. The family's interactions grew strained, and the once vibrant home was now overshadowed by a palpable sense of fear. One evening, as Mr. Smith was watching TV in the living room, he heard a sound coming from the attic, a place they rarely used. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps moving across the floor. With a growing sense of dread, he climbed the stairs to investigate. The attic was dusty and filled with old boxes and forgotten belongings. The thumping grew louder as he approached the center of the room. There, on an old trunk, sat the doll. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere, its eyes gleaming in the dim light of the attic. Mr. Smith hesitated, then picked up the doll, its presence sending a chill through him. As he carried it downstairs, he felt as if something was tugging at his mind, whispering dark, enticing promises. The family decided to seek help. They contacted a local paranormal investigator, a man named Arthur Hughes, who had a reputation for dealing with malevolent entities. Arthur arrived at the house with a collection of equipment, EMF meters, infrared cameras, and recording devices. Arthur spent several hours investigating the house. He interviewed the family, conducted a thorough search, and set up his equipment. As night fell, he began his investigation in Emily's room, where the doll had first caused disturbances. Using a thermal camera, Arthur captured strange cold spots and erratic temperature fluctuations. The EMF meter spiked in certain areas of the room, particularly near the doll's former resting place. Arthur conducted a seance, trying to communicate with whatever spirit might be attached to the doll. During the seance, the atmosphere in the room grew oppressive. The temperature dropped significantly, and the air seemed to hum with a dark energy. Arthur's attempts to communicate were met with chilling responses, disembodied whispers and fleeting shadows on the walls. As the seance concluded, Arthur revealed that the doll was indeed a vessel for a malevolent spirit, a powerful entity that thrived on fear and despair. It had attached itself to the doll, using it as a conduit to manipulate and terrify the family. The family was desperate for a solution. Arthur suggested that the doll be exorcised and the house cleansed to remove the lingering malevolent energy. He performed a ritual to cleanse the doll, using sacred chants and symbols to drive the spirit away. The process was intense, filled with strange occurrences and unsettling phenomena. During the ritual, the doll seemed to resist the exorcism. Its eyes appeared to follow Arthur's movements, and the temperature in the room fluctuated wildly. Despite the challenges, Arthur managed to complete the ritual, sealing the spirit away and breaking its hold over the doll. With the doll exorcised, the house slowly returned to normal. The disturbances ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The Smiths were able to reclaim their home, though they were left with an indelible mark of their experience. The doll was removed from the house and placed in a secure, isolated location where it could do no more harm. The family tried to move on from the ordeal, but the memory of the possessed doll lingered in their minds. They were forever changed by the experience, their once peaceful home now marked by the shadows of a haunting past. The antique shop where Mrs. Smith had found the doll went out of business shortly after the events. The shopkeeper, who had seemed so dismissive of the doll's origins, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a sense of mystery and unease. No one ever learned what truly happened to him or the doll after that. And so, the story of the possessed doll became a chilling legend in the town, a tale of terror and the unknown, a reminder that sometimes, the most innocuous objects can harbor the darkest of secrets.